So, Marc, remind me, you will have
Human rights.
human rights. Okay. Welcome everyone to this press conference from the Interfaith Liaison Committee. We are here to present the Interfaith Talanoa dialogue, something that we produced last Sunday. People from different faith communities, about 100 of us, gathered together to talk about the different parts that is a part of this COP, but also to demonstrate that people of different faith actually can find a common ground when it comes to talking about the great challenges that we are in front of today. So I don't want to keep the talking too much. I want to leave it also to my friends to talk, just for the setting of what is this kind of interfaith work, and how do we relate, and how do we relate to each other, and what kind of messages do we want, both for the COP, but also for our different faith communities to take action on the climate challenge. Please, Maureen.
Thank you very much. This is just my second COP, but I certainly have been very heartened to see how faiths are coming together to provide a voice, and this was one of our main calls, to include the voice of faith communities and of religious leaders. If they're at the table, then maybe things can be done a little differently. I think that one of the key points of our call as faith communities is it's the importance of building trust between politicians and faiths. And where there is trust, then there will be greater communication and learning and exchange with each other. Religious communities have a huge outreach. 84% of the world subscribes to a faith, 94% in Africa. And the outreach in terms of education is huge. We as faith communities have a huge responsibility to educate regarding the climate, the science, and environmentally friendly practices. Education is key. And we also have a responsibility to communicate the needs of people on the ground. Where faiths also have a huge role is in building spiritual capacity through spiritual practices to build up inner resilience, and the resilience of a community and the bringing to bear of the wisdom of faiths can enable a community to move through climate difficulties. And we are hoping that we do not head to a climate catastrophe, but we do know that there are hurdles to move along on the way and many things to face. And so spiritual resilience is vital, and this is what the faith communities can provide. I think that's in essence what I would like to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This Talanoa call, you can find it on the web afterwards, but it's structured that we take different subjects that is also part of the COP discussion, but we give it an interfaith response to it. So I would like Bishop Marc to say something about human rights and climate change and climate-induced migration, if you would. Please.
Thank you, Henrik. The call has numbers of elements. I'm going to emphasize two. First, we see across the world that when human rights are elided or denied, we also see at the same time an extractive, objectifying relationship of people to the planet as well, to the land. So the denial of human rights and the denial of the vitality and the life of the land go hand in hand. By the same token, one factor that we bring forward is that indigenous peoples around the world have an interlocking relationship with ecosystems in which they live. They can't, even in their minds and hearts, conceive, in many cases, of moving somewhere else, relocating to another forest somewhere. Their lives are inextricably linked with the ecosystem in which they have lived, often for millennia. So human rights, in the case of indigenous people, almost necessarily means protecting the ecosystem in which they live. With that, we have an emphasis on protecting the environment protectors. We know that, for instance, in the Amazon, there's a shocking number of forest protectors who are being deliberately targeted, because to take them out removes a crucial support for the integrity of the forest. Finally, because we are faith bodies, we also understand that there is no real divide between the inner world, so-called inner world, and the outer world. And one of the things we have in the call is a transformation of consciousness. And I would like to put that in terms of what I have heard called the decolonization of our minds. The decolonization of our minds. The idea that we have imbued our own minds with the ideas of empire, and that for us to be healthily related for human rights and planet rights, we need to decolonize our own hearts and minds. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And the next point on this is loss and damage. And loss and damage is a big issue at this COP. And we see it would be a real bad COP if nothing comes out on loss and damage. This is something that we have been discussed over many COPs. It has a thin thread still hanging on, but this time we also see so much of climate-related disasters. So the need for the loss and damage funding is higher than ever, and we really want this to be a part of this. But also, coming from faith communities, there is something that we call a non-economic loss and damages. That has to be acknowledged. When you lose your ancestors where you lived, where you have your ancestors buried, when the land is drowned, or in small island states, for example, that is also a loss that must be acknowledged. You can't pay for it, but it must be a part of the discussion of loss and damage, not monetizing everything. But it is. I think it's important that it will be there. I will leave the word for young people and also on indigenous people to Kata, please.
Thank you. One of the things that brings us together across difference is faith, and another one for youth is that our age connects us, because we're going to be here in 2100 to see the result of the commitments that we're making now. Here with the Lutheran World Federation Youth Delegation, we're bringing youth together from across countries, different regions of the world, and that's something that faith can do for us. And it's important to uplift the leadership of young people, because as young people, we will accept nothing less than the highest ambition on climate goals, including limiting the greenhouse gas emissions to 1.5 degrees of warming, because we understand the severity of the impact that would have on our lands and lives into the future. So for myself, as a non-Indigenous person living north of the Arctic Circle on the continuous permafrost on Inuvialuit and Gwich'in lands, I understand that 1.5 degrees of warming is a tipping point for the release of hundreds of gigatons of greenhouse gases that are stored in the permafrost. And we heard that there's a 50-50 chance that we'll reach 1.5 degrees of warming in the next 5 years. And so this is completely unacceptable to young people. And so we're grounded in our faith to make commitments to move towards these mitigation efforts. And I want to bring to you the word from one of our young people, a grade 4 student, only 10 years old, who wanted their message to be heard at COP, who said, "I think that people should find a way to stop putting gas in the air. The earth does so much for us. Now look what's happened." And you can see that there's a bunch of pollution and greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And similarly, coming from the Arctic region, I understand that Indigenous climate leadership is the most successful example of climate leadership that we have. And so we stand in solidarity with Indigenous leadership in climate action as interfaith communities, recognizing as well our historic and ongoing interference with that leadership, and that has resulted in some of the colonial interventions that have caused the climate crisis, which is the #1 threat to the lands and lives of Indigenous peoples. And so coming from the ACT Alliance, the Lutheran World Federation, and speaking on behalf of young people, I hope that you remember some of these messages, and especially what our children have brought to the table.
Thank you so much. Really important. I think, just briefly, we also have on gender-inclusive climate action, and knowing from earlier COPs that gender often seems to be going off the text the closer you get to the end of the COP. Still, that is a very important part also from people of faith. We see the importance of a global recognition of women and girls in all their diversity as the most vulnerable and who are impacted by the climate crisis. And that has to be included so that the climate crisis is not just looked at as a technical thing that has to do with investment that is very male-driven. Many of the inputs on climate change or actions on climate change also come from very much from women perspective that is more sustainable than other ones. So learning also from how micro economic contributions going to women to create a sustainable economy, we also think that a sustainable work on climate change must include women also as one part, not only vulnerable, but also as an important actor for climate justice. We also talk about the finance for climate action and adaptation, and we think it's very, very, I mean, we're very sad over that what promised in Paris in 2015 to have a working fund for adaptation with $100 billion a year should happen year 2020. We are year 2022, and we don't see that it's still not up to $100 a year, $1 billion a year. And I think that is a shame. And when people are now looking for, say they come with new finance, is very, very often just renaming something different or taking it from another source. It must be additional money to that adaptation fund. So that is also important. I want to give the floor to Safet to say something about ecocide law. Ecocide law is something that is something growing interest from many actors of the world to protect ecosystem, but also to have a law where you can actually have people convicted for crimes to ecosystem. That is something Safet could say something about.
Yes, Assalamu alaikum, greetings of peace. I'm speaking today to you on behalf of the Parliament of World Religions. Many consider it to be the birthplace in 1893 in Chicago of the Interfaith movement. As a member of the board and as co-chair of the Climate Action Task Force, we work closely with fellow faith-based organizations and civil society groups to pass this August an historic passing at the General Assembly through aggressive advocacy of the R2HE, the Right to Healthy Environment General Assembly resolution. And what that resolution basically declares and establishes is something that was embedded within the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in many of the articles, but not articulated clearly. And that is that every human being has a right to a clean, safe, and healthy environment. And what this does is it establishes the defenders that my dear brother Bishop Marcus has spoken about, the defenders of the environment, as also the defenders of human rights. So to defend the environment is to defend human rights, and to defend human rights is to defend the environment. Connected to that is the ecocide law. The Parliament of the World Religions was very happy and honored to be able to endorse the incredible work of the World Council of Churches, and specifically Reverend Henrik and many members of the panel here, to bring into fore the Manifesto for Ecocide, in which ecocide, as was mentioned, will become part of the Rome statutes that treat genocide and ecocide in the same language. For without a legal framework, and we understand that as faith leaders, without a legal framework of enforcement and accountability, the killing, the murdering of creation, and the murdering of all who are benefiting and who are living as a result of that mutually dependent and interdependent relationship with creation, which includes us, will continue. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that was a very powerful way of expressing it. We also have a point on just transition and mitigation. And I think if we're talking about climate justice, and we know we have to do the mitigation, but also at the same time, we can't leave people behind. We can't just look at the environmental impact. We also have a social impact of this transition. So a just transition involves that people who may lose their livelihoods or are endangered, and maybe also not will accept climate mitigation, there have to be works for that as well. That also goes away in the line of this non-fossil fuel proliferation treaty that talks about stop all new exploitation of fossil fuels, and at the same time make a just transition. Those depending on the fossil fuel business for the daily bread, they have to be taken into account when we go from the fossil fuel driven societies and economies. So I think that's more or less what I wanted to contribute to this. I think we are open for questions. Anyone who want to put some questions to. And yes, thank you for reminding me, Kata want to end this with a quote from you young people, children.
I wish that our children were in these rooms, that they were intergenerational spaces where our children could speak for themselves. But because they're not here, I'll leave you with one more message from another grade 4 student, 10 years old, who was asked what she wants leaders to know at COP27. And she drew a picture of some devastation of the land. And the person in the picture is saying, "Why is the world so cruel?" She says, "This is what I think the world will look like in the future. Do we want the world to look like this? No, so help us fix it now. I hope you understand this letter. Thank you." And I just want to ask the UNFCCC and people here at COP27, do you understand? Do you understand what she's saying? She's asking you. Thank you.
Any questions? Yes. We have Vanya and a microphone.
Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation from all the speakers. Before the Paris Global Agreement, the Holy Father Pope Franciscus, he challenged the leaders in the General Assembly of the United Nations to stop selling guns and to keep the needy kids alive. Now, yesterday in our report, we realized that the countries who are involved in military development is more expensive on military. They are the ones who fail to show their commitment, what they agree even in Glasgow during the previous COP. So, what is the moral responsibility of the faith communities for this campaign to reduce military spending and to get more funds to get the targets of the Paris Global Agreement and of the Sustainable Development Goal? and of course at the same time, countries suffering of poverty, how also to reduce more military expenses, like in Pakistan, and to have guarantees from the international community for their geographical territories. So the question to all the members of the panel about this moral responsibility of the faith communities for this campaign. Thank you.
Who want to start? Bishop Marc? No? Okay.
Seraphine, always you express this with so much eloquence. I agree, and I don't have anything to add to that.
Just to say that it's a moral imperative, for sure, and every religion teaches peace. And I just remembering a quote from our previous spiritual head who passed away at 104, and she said that God didn't give us power to fight one another. God gave us power for peace. True religion means peace. And we must continue to express that in everything that we do. And there must be a way. I'm not a scientist, I'm not an economist, I'm not a lawyer, but there must be a way of engaging people in using the peace dividend that can come from relinquishing the incredible lucrative trade in arms. There must be a way of transitioning to something that is much more fulfilling for those people themselves. Thank you.
Thank you. And just to add to that, I think that the biggest weapon of mass destruction we have now is the fossil fuel, because the fossil fuel is going to, if we accelerate the use of fossil fuel, it's a real danger. It's a weapon of mass destruction. Vanya, please.
Thank you, Vanya Walkley, the Malta Business Weekly. My question relates to the stellar leadership of Pope Francis, who comes out with this wonderful encyclical and many, many statements, but are we seeing a lot of activity at national level from the Catholic churches, maybe in your countries, to sort of lead the charge of the faith on climate change?
So I'm sorry we have no Catholic in the panel, but we have Catholic who is in our dialogue. I would, yeah, please go ahead.
So I could respond to that. Vanya, I think that what we've seen with the encyclical is something of a world phenomenon. People of many denominations and different faiths have created study groups around Laudato Si, and it's I think it's brought an awareness, this inner transformation for many people, and activism has resulted from it. It's not just study groups. I think it's Laudato Si is one of the most significant documents of the early 21st century.
Henrik, can I say? Henrik,
A question?
can I say
Yeah.
something?
Stafford, you want to say something? Please
Yeah,
go.
just earlier this morning at another press conference, we had our brother from the Laudato Si movement from the Catholic Church, and in terms of actionable items, he declared very clearly the Vatican position with regard to fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, that they fully endorse and support that treaty, and that's critical as we move forward dealing with the mega monster of fossil fuels.
We got time for some questions, please, in the front.
Yeah, I mean, a small question. I think in between, okay, besides advocating at the COPs, which I think is important, and I think the interfaith advocacy is bold and significant, I think we must also look inwards and commit to doing things between the COPs on a daily basis, both within each of our religions and in an interfaith manner. So, I mean, any reaction to this or any examples from past work that you have done, it will help.
We take the other question also, sir.
Thank you very much. Two questions. I'd be interested in how faith communities have been able to express their faith here at COP. It'd be interesting to hear your reactions to this. Has this been a place where you've been able to express your faith? And secondly, there are now a new generation of just energy transition partnerships, South Africa, Indonesia. Are there any examples of faith communities on the ground getting involved in just transition activities, which you mentioned as one of your priorities?
Let's see, two different questions. Anyone who wants to start? Marc? Or
I thought I would address the first question. What I've discovered since starting to come in 2015 with the Paris COP is that the people who are here, not only with the NGOs, but in fact, people on negotiating teams, have grounded practices of environmental stewardship in their own countries, in their own lives. They're not simply coming here and negotiating on policy. They're people who are doing remarkable projects in their countries. I think of one in South America where the negotiator was teaching in a university but also helping his students protect mangrove stands. So I think it's a both and. It's both this global advocacy, which, as you say, we must do this, but they're doing it out of a basis of their own lived experience.
I'd just like to reiterate that when you listen to the different projects that faith communities are doing on an ongoing basis, it's very, very impressive. And I think the media has a part to play, of course. We have to communicate the disasters that are happening, but how much is communicated of the ongoing projects that are really making a difference on the ground? And I think that if these were communicated more intensely or more visibly, it would give people a lot more hope and would begin to shift the atmosphere and attitude. So I think that's important.
So I give the last word to Kata to round up.
In the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada, I sit on the Carbon Neutral Task Force, and I think that one example is for us to demonstrate leadership in the tasks that we are asking for from leadership here, and to do it in our own faith communities. And we're seeing people doing that on the ground. And I think another way that we engage in this space here is not only to try and be an example of implementing what we're asking for, but I think also the idea that people don't need to fracture themselves to come into these spaces. You can come into these spaces whole. And actually we're more attuned to transformational leadership when we come into these spaces whole, with our communities with us, with our faith with us, with our families with us, with our emotions with us. And so when we see those kinds of commitment from not only faith community members who are existing in these spaces like COP, but also from negotiators, from politicians, from leaders, when they come in whole, then we can commit to a transformational change. And that's what we need to see, a political will for transformational change to uplift the people who are most affected.
Thank you so much, and thank you for coming.